What will happen when a woman, thrilled and eager to meet her old friend a gorilla in the forest, finds herself surrounded by a whole group of them? Excitement turns into tension as she approaches her friend, only to find herself alone in the midst of the gorillas. Just as the forest ranger gets ready to step in, her gorilla friend surprises everyone with a shocking and unbelievable act. The story begins with Carmelia Wood and her father Richard setting off on an adventure they had dreamed about for years. They were on their way to see the gorillas they once cared for so deeply. Traveling by boat, they scanned the riverbanks, and soon they spotted the incredible creatures not far from the shore. Even though they were told to keep their distance, the desire to reconnect with the animals was strong, especially for Carmelia. She was convinced that the bond she had with the gorillas would still be there. In her heart, she hoped the gorillas remembered her as much as she remembered them. But a small part of her knew that time may have changed things. The gorillas had created new families in the wild and had been living without people for many years. As their boat moved slowly along the river, several gorilla heads peeked through the thick bushes, curiously watching. Carmelia's heart skipped a beat when she recognized Samson, one gorilla she would never forget. Even though he had grown much larger, she was sure it was him. Ignoring her father's warnings, Carmelia leapt from the boat, eager to reconnect. Samson approached, his massive figure towering over her, and now she stood alone. Samson approached, his eyes locked on Carmelia. Suddenly, he grabbed her arm with surprising strength. Richard, her father, was ready to rush in and help, but he knew that startling the gorilla could make things worse. The tension was high. Carmelia had devoted her life to loving and caring for gorillas, but now it seemed one might harm her. Could this really be how their bond ended? It was hard for Carmelia to believe that the gentle creature she had once cared for could turn dangerous, but the situation was becoming perilous. Their special connection began many years ago, driven by Richard's deep love for animals. He started the Wood Foundation to rescue and rehabilitate animals, especially gorillas, and help them return to the wild. The family also ran Hollett Zoo in Canterbury, where they looked after animals that couldn't be released back into the wild. Carmelia and her siblings grew up in the zoo, creating close bonds with the animals they cared for. When Carmelia was just over a year old, a gorilla named Apollo arrived at the zoo. He was injured and orphaned by poachers and needed constant care. Richard and his team provided help, and Carmelia and her siblings were always nearby. Apollo quickly became a close friend, and Carmelia often spent time with him, making sure he never felt alone. Growing up with Apollo was magical, but their lives were about to change even more with an unexpected event. Richard picked Carmelia up from school with thrilling news. A new arrival was waiting at the zoo. The surprise was Samson, a tiny baby gorilla who had lost his mother. Samson was too small to survive alone, so he needed lots of care. Carmelia, now old enough to help, eagerly took on the job of feeding and comforting him. As Samson grew, it became clear he couldn't stay in their home forever. Gorillas aren't meant to be house pets, so it was time for Samson to move to the zoo's gorilla enclosure. Apollo, the zoo's older gorilla, was ready to meet him. The introduction had to be done carefully since Apollo was much bigger and might accidentally hurt Samson. But after meeting through a gate and getting to know each other, the two gorillas quickly became friends. They touched faces and played together, becoming inseparable in no time. Carmelia was thrilled to see Samson and Apollo become such close friends, and she loved spending time playing with them. But getting people to believe this was safe was a different story. When a photography team visited, they captured footage of Carmelia and her siblings interacting with the gorillas. The reaction was intense. People were outraged that children were allowed inside the gorilla enclosure with such powerful animals. The zoo received a serious warning, and from then on, Carmelia could only see Samson and Apollo from outside their enclosure. This separation was heartbreaking for everyone. Carmelia and the gorillas couldn't understand why they could no longer be together. Every day after school, Carmelia would sit by the glass of the enclosure, pressing her hand against it. Samson would do the same on the other side, trying to reach her. Their touching hands through the glass was a sad reminder of the new distance between them. As time passed, the plans to reintroduce Samson and Apollo to the wild began. Although it was hard for Carmelia to accept, she understood it was the right thing for them. Richard and his team worked tirelessly for months, training the gorillas to adjust back to life in the wild. Finally, the day came for them to be transported to a sanctuary in Gabon, Africa. Carmelia said an emotional goodbye, hugging Samson and Apollo tightly before they were loaded onto a vehicle for the long journey. Years went by, and Carmelia hadn't seen her old friends. Richard visited the gorillas once, but Carmelia hadn't returned to Africa since they were released. She was told the gorillas had adapted well, and that visiting might disturb their new way of life. However, when Richard had a health scare and planned another trip to Gabon, Carmelia insisted on going with him. She knew the gorillas might not remember her, but she needed to see them again. The trip to Gabon was exhausting, but as they arrived and took a small boat down the river to search for the gorillas, Carmelia's heart raced with excitement. It wasn't long before they spotted familiar faces peeking through the trees. Samson and Apollo were watching them from afar, and even though they looked different, Carmelia recognized them immediately. She gasped in disbelief, overwhelmed with joy at seeing her old friends again. When Samson moved toward her and grabbed her arm, Carmelia's heart raced with fear. But as she gazed into his eyes, she saw something familiar: recognition. Slowly, Samson lowered his head and pressed it gently against hers, just like he used to when he was younger. Carmelia felt a wave of warmth and comfort, as if their old bond was coming back to life. She stroked his head, and Samson responded by softly rubbing her arms, greeting her in the same affectionate way he had before. Moments later, Apollo appeared and carefully reached out to touch Carmelia's face with one finger. The reunion was touching and full of emotion. Richard approached cautiously, but the two gorillas eagerly jumped on him, clearly happy to see their old friend. The guides, who had been worried about how the gorillas would react, were amazed at how quickly Samson and Apollo returned to their loving behavior. As the time to leave drew near, Samson and Apollo made soft, sad moaning sounds, clearly not wanting the visit to end. Carmelia's eyes welled up with tears as she said her goodbyes, knowing this might be the last time she saw them. Samson pressed his head against her chest one last time. She kissed him gently on the top of his head, whispering that she loved him before stepping onto the boat. As they floated away, Carmelia felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had been warned not to visit, told that the gorillas might not remember her, and that the reunion could be risky. But she had followed her heart, and in doing so, rekindled a bond that had withstood the test of time. It was a beautiful reminder of the deep, unspoken connections that can exist between humans and animals, and the enduring power of love across species. So, what are your thoughts about this heart-touching story? Share your opinions in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on our new animal stories. Your support means the world to us.